The first thing in clothing is quality. There's a right way. It's like so many things in life. There's a right way and a wrong way. And if you do things the right way in making clothing or in selecting clothing, or now I'm talking theory here because we are not competing with pennies, we're not competing with Downs or Aldi or any of those people. We just choose our own ground and we play our best game on that. I'm afraid I'm committed to a rather formal image when I'm working. And it's, I think a pinstripe looks very well. And each staff member wears a tailored item as well. It's a little bit like a declaration. This is what we do. The tenant before my father was John White, and he got on very well with my father and my father with him. That's a photograph. The staff at the time, 1905, and this was my father who was working here. And after my father had worked for John White for about 5 or 7 years, my father got a job in Galway, in Moons, which was the big business in the west of Ireland at the time. And his job there was buying the woolens. That meant that he went out to Connemara and bought the tweed. And so John White's son contracted tuberculosis. And in 1909, if you got tuberculosis, you had 2 prospects. One was you could die gracefully, or the other was you could go out to California. And in the desert, the hope was that the consumption, as they called it, would dry up. So John White wanted to take his family and go to California. And he wrote to my father in Galway and said, Michael, I know you always wanted to own your own business. Come up and we'll see if we can do a deal. So that was how we ended up. That's how Whites became Mullaney's. At that stage, he was just a little over 30. Tom, his brother, was maybe 10 years older, but they clubbed up, the two of them, and started general drapery, but with a particular interest in men's tailoring. And we had a tailor's workshop, which would have 12 tailors in it, out the back. And he cut and kept ahead of those tailors and ran a business. So he worked very hard. And so, of course, the relevance for all of this to what we're talking about in the main, the books, was that whites were shipping agents. So when Tom and Michael Mullaney bought the place, the business, they also bought the shipping agency. Essentially, this book, it's a list of all the people who booked through us, or through whites, from 1906 onwards. And it's really just a record of their fare and a record of their journey. And it starts with Patrick MacDonald of Calry, Sligo, who went to New York on the White Star, WS White Star liner Oceanic on March the 11th. He travelled third class and he paid £7.16. They were almost all from the county, largely up in the north of the county, Mahrow, Carney, Glyphny, but also down south towards Ballymote and Beltra, all over the county really, and Ross's Point, Brocka, Dramard, Churchill, Sligo, and so on, all down through the whole families left. Mrs. B. Hartnell with John, Bartley, Daniel, all went to, on the Cunard line, Campania, on the 5th of March, and they paid a total of £23, 12 shillings and sixpence for the mother and the children, four children. And it was quite surprising numbers at the time, the numbers of people who were emigrating. Even this is now in the 20th century, the numbers of people who were emigrating was enormous. And people weren't choosy about their vessels at that time, as long as they could get to New York or Quebec or Australia or wherever. And Canada really was the very first emigration destination for Irish people. They were mostly from the southeast. They were mostly Wexford. They were fishermen who went out to fish the banks, the Newfoundland banks, and they went out every year and came home every year until they established there in Canada. And Newfoundland is still recognizably Irish. And many who went to Canada went down then with the building of the railways to central areas in America, like Louisville, and also to Minnesota. People were conditioned for hardship at the time, so it would not have been seen as hardship. The exotic nature of getting on a boat and going off to America, and they sounded a lot more exotic to those who sailed on them, because now there's the Ausonia, the Cedric, the Laurentia, the Adriatic, the Celtic, the Canadian Pacific, and so on. That's the North German Lloyd. That was issued in my uncle's name, Thomas Joseph Mullaney Draper, 9 Knox Street, as it then was. Now that's Agents Authority for 1924, and that is the Cunard line in my father's name, Michael Charles Mullaney. And this one is the Union Castle steamship, used to call to Portuguese East Africa, Tanganyika Territory and Kenya Colony, and the islands of Ascension, St. Helena and Lobito. I'm not sure where Lobito was. It certainly isn't its name today. Well, it was an adventure, of course, and they were going into unknown territory, and they put on their best front. And the spin-off, of course, for our firm was that they were kitted out as well with their suit and their suitcase, if they were fortunate enough to have enough money to have a suitcase. And so it was a good relationship between the two parts of the business. And that's where the travel agency evolved out of, and it's here ever since, and we're now the only travel agents in the county.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. I wonder if you can help me.
Yeah, of course.
I was thinking of going to Malibin maybe September.
Yeah, no problem.
We have a staff of 5 in the agency, and some of them are with us for 25 years. We kept on all our staff right through the COVID.
Would you be looking to go from Knock or Dublin?
Preferably not.
Yeah.
So that is not forgotten by our customers.
I understand you also do hotel bookings.
We do indeed,
Yeah.
yeah. Benamedina, Torremolinos.
Where would be quietest?
Benamedina is a little bit quieter if you wanted to try there maybe.
You see, the big advantage in booking with a travel agent is that we are bonded. We have to subscribe to a national bond. And there are so many different reasons for booking with a travel agent that the agency business has very well recovered. This book has been in and out of American courts to prove people's entitlement under an intestacy, say. There is no will, and the intestacy then has to be fully proven. And so every so often there's an American court here in town, a fully constituted American court. So the American court goes around all of Ireland once every 4 years or so, or it did at this time. I don't know whether it still does, possibly not, but at that time it did, and they used to hold it in the Imperial Hotel, all that sort of detail. So this book has it's stamped where it was in American courts. My father and his brother Tom, by 1921 they had put enough money together to recast the front of the house. So they did, and I always have great respect for what they did, because they hadn't a lot of money to waste, but everything they did was the very best that could be had at the time. Like the doors, for instance, are Burmese teak. You can't get Burmese teak today. When we were buying teak in 1960 for the new part of the building, we had to settle for Iroko teak, which is the African teak. But the Burmese teak was all nature sown. It wasn't commercial planting, and it was so dense that it looks like marble nearly. And then they are clad with the beautiful Art Nouveau brass handles, so that they're just a work of art, the doors are. And the mosaics then are very interesting because they were set in the Ravenna fan style. Ravenna, of course, is where the mosaics started in the 6th century. The Ravenna fan was how they set their mosaics. It allowed them, the little chips didn't have to be identical. They were all used in a discrete way. Nowadays they're mostly set geometrically. These are all set in the fan, and it makes for a much more interesting sign. And the setting of the name was done in London. The letters were cast in copper, and then they were coated in 24-carat gold leaf. And by the local contractor, they were turned upside down on the glass, and the glass painted around them. And the result is that 105 years later, those letters are still impeccable, and we never have to touch them. We have to varnish and paint and all that, but the actual lettering is never touched. My father and Tom had impeccable taste and impeccable courage, because it was costing a lot of money and they didn't have a lot of money, and so it was a debt which I owe still.
Mullaney Brothers as an institution is a very big part of the social and commercial fabric of Sligo. There's no question about that. It has been for such a long time that it's sort of ingrained in the culture of people, particularly visitors who come for the first time. And obviously quite a striking shop front. It's something that they note and photograph all the time. But even for our visitors who are returning, and family and friends from abroad who come back for their holidays and visit their family, it's a touchstone for them. We're still here. We're still Sligo for them. That's hugely important. But that's historic. I mean, we are not a showcase. We're a business, and for me, the focus has to be tomorrow.
Every summer, we get a steady procession of people who have come. My grandmother was from Maharao, or my grandfather was from Ballymote. And one day I was locking the front door, and this customer had come behind me, and I stepped back on his toe, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And before I had turned, he said, "I'm sorry too." And I said, "My goodness, you're one of us, but you don't sound like it." And he said, "Well, you're so right. I am one of you, but I have just failed to prove it." And I said, "Oh, how did that happen?" He said, "I've come up from looking over the baptismal records, and I failed to find my grandmother." And I said, "Oh, and when did she go out?" She went out in 1913, I think it was. And I said, "Do you know what time of year?" "I do. She arrived very close to St. Patrick's Day." And so I said, "Will you hold on for a minute there?" And I went up to get my book and found, sure enough, there was his granny and her sister, and we had booked the two. And when I came down, I said, she went with her sister, didn't she? And he said, how on earth could you have known that? I said, I know because we booked her. There she is. And the poor fellow almost fainted. He was so delighted. It was so funny, but to him it was a triumph. When my father and his brother Tom bought the leasehold in 1909, the rental was £60 a year, which was a formidable enough figure at the time. But the best advice I ever got in my life was from my brother Tom. After my father died, I was undertaking the rebuilding of the rear of the shop. And he said to me, Tom said to me, before you do anything else, buy your freehold. And extremely emphasized it was. And I said, but Tom, we're up to our gills at the moment to do this job. And he said, I'm telling you, don't do anything until you buy your freehold. And fortunately, I did in 1960. When you're 25 years old, the world isn't nearly as intimidating as it is when you're 91 years old. So I wasn't a bit nervous about this. Everything was going to go according to plan.